In 2019, the United States imposed what it called the toughest sanctions ever placed on Venezuela's oil industry. The goal was simple: cut off the Maduro government from its only major source of revenue and force a political collapse. 3 years later, Venezuela was exporting more oil than it had in years. Not less, more. That number is not a rounding error. At the peak of sanctions pressure, Venezuela's state oil company PDVSA was moving somewhere between 700,000 and 900,000 barrels a day. By 2023, independent tracking firms put that figure closer to 900,000, with some estimates pushing past 1 million. The United States had spent years and billions of dollars in enforcement trying to reduce that number to zero. It never came close. So where does the money go? Venezuela earns its oil revenue almost entirely outside the dollar system now. Payments arrive in yuan, in euros, through crypto wallets, through third-country intermediaries, and through barter arrangements where oil is exchanged directly for food, medicine, and industrial parts. The financial architecture that was supposed to strangle Caracas has instead taught it to breathe through different lungs. The sanctions themselves are staggering in scale. By the early 2020s, the U.S. Treasury had blacklisted dozens of tankers, sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan officials, and placed asset freezes on entities in multiple countries connected to PDVSA. The estimated value of assets frozen or blocked across the entire sanctions program runs into the tens of billions of dollars. And still, the oil moves. What makes this possible is not corruption in the traditional sense, though that is part of it. What makes it possible is a deliberately constructed global logistics system that operates just below the threshold of visibility. It has its own vessels, its own insurance, its own payment rails, its own paperwork. It functions like a shadow version of the legitimate oil trade, running parallel to it, sometimes intersecting with it, and consistently profitable enough that new participants keep joining. This system did not appear overnight. It was built piece by piece, deal by deal, starting years before the harshest sanctions hit. Venezuela had time to prepare, and it used that time. The result is one of the most sophisticated sanctions evasion infrastructures in the world. Understanding it starts with one question: where did all those ships come from? A tanker does not become a shadow vessel overnight. It goes through a transformation, a deliberate process of obscuring who owns it, who operates it, where it is registered, and what it is carrying. That process has been applied to hundreds of ships now linked to Venezuelan oil exports, and the method is almost always the same. It starts with ownership. A legitimate shipping company will have a clear corporate structure, a parent company, known shareholders, a registered address that actually corresponds to a real office. Shadow fleet operators do the opposite. They layer ownership through chains of shell companies registered in jurisdictions that ask very few questions. The Marshall Islands, Panama, Gabon, Cameroon. These are common flags of convenience because their maritime registries are large, loosely monitored, and easy to access remotely. A company registered in one of these places might be owned by a holding company in another, which is in turn owned by a trust with a nominee director who has no actual role in operations. By the time you reach the real decision-maker, you have crossed 4 or 5 legal borders. Then comes the flag. Ships can change their flag state, the country whose laws they operate under, relatively quickly. A vessel sanctioned while flying the flag of one country can be re-registered under another within weeks. This is not illegal in itself, which is part of what makes it so effective. The same ship, with the same hull, the same cargo history, the same ownership buried under the same shell structure, simply appears under a new national identity. Tracking agencies have documented individual tankers changing flags 3 and 4 times in a single year. The names change too. Renaming a vessel is straightforward and inexpensive. A ship called the Pacific Star becomes the Atlantic Horizon, becomes the Golden Wave. Each name change resets the vessel's surface-level identity in commercial databases. Insurers, port authorities, and customs officials who rely on name searches rather than hull identification numbers can be left chasing a ship that no longer officially exists under its previous identity. What emerged from this process, applied systematically across a fleet of somewhere between 50 and 150 active vessels depending on the period, is a logistics network with real capacity. These ships are not ancient rust buckets limping across the ocean. Many are mid-sized tankers fully capable of carrying 1 million barrels or more. Some were purpose acquired for this trade. Others drifted into it when their commercial prospects elsewhere dried up. Either way, they are the physical backbone of everything that follows. Every ship above a certain size is legally required to broadcast its location. The system is called AIS, the Automatic Identification System, and it transmits a vessel's position, speed, heading, and identity continuously to nearby ships and coastal stations. It was designed for collision avoidance and maritime safety. It has become one of the primary tools that sanctions enforcers, intelligence agencies, and investigative journalists use to track where oil is going. Shadow fleet operators know this, so the first thing many of them do is turn it off. Going dark, as it is called in the industry, is technically a violation of international maritime law. But enforcement is inconsistent, and the penalties are rarely severe enough to deter a ship making hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage. A tanker departing a Venezuelan terminal can switch off its transponder within hours of leaving port, disappear from commercial tracking databases, complete a transfer at sea, and reappear days later in a completely different location with a fabricated position history uploaded to make the gap look routine. The transfer at sea is where the real operational cleverness comes in. Rather than sailing directly from Venezuela to a buyer in China or elsewhere, sanctioned cargo moves through what the industry calls ship-to-ship transfers. Two vessels meet in open water, often in areas with minimal radar coverage, outside the territorial waters of any nation with enforcement capability. The oil pumps from one hull to the other. The originating tanker turns back toward Venezuela. The receiving vessel continues toward its destination with cargo that now has no documented connection to PDVSA. These transfers happen most frequently in specific zones that have become well known to tracking analysts. Areas off the coast of Malaysia, near the Strait of Malacca, in the Gulf of Oman, and in stretches of the South Atlantic have all served as transfer points at various times. The locations shift when scrutiny increases and relocate when enforcement pressure eases elsewhere. Documentation is falsified at multiple points in the chain. Bills of lading list fictional ports of origin. Cargo manifests describe the oil as coming from Malaysia, Oman, or other non-sanctioned producers. Blending, mixing Venezuelan crude with oil from other sources, makes chemical fingerprinting harder, though not impossible. By the time a cargo arrives at a refinery in Shandong province or a storage terminal in Southeast Asia, the paper trail points nowhere near Caracas. The physical oil and its official story have been completely separated. The oil has to go somewhere, and for Venezuela, the answer is overwhelmingly China. Independent tracking estimates suggest that somewhere between 60 and 80% of Venezuela's sanctioned oil exports flow to Chinese buyers, primarily independent refineries concentrated in Shandong province. These refineries, sometimes called teapots because of their smaller scale relative to state-owned giants, have become the backbone of Venezuela's export survival. They are not state enterprises. They are private businesses making commercial decisions, and the commercial decision they keep making is that discounted Venezuelan crude is worth the regulatory risk. The discount is significant. Venezuelan heavy crude sells at somewhere between $5 and $15 below benchmark prices per barrel, sometimes more. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of barrels per day, and the savings become too large for price-sensitive independent refiners to ignore. The United States has sanctioned some of these buyers. It has threatened others with secondary sanctions, penalties applied not to Venezuelan entities but to foreign companies that do business with them. The threat has slowed some transactions. It has not stopped the overall flow. Cuba sits in a different category. The arrangement between Caracas and Havana predates the harshest sanctions and operates more like a political subsidy than a commercial transaction. Venezuela ships oil to Cuba at preferential rates, sometimes in exchange for Cuban medical personnel and security advisors deployed inside Venezuela. Exact volumes are difficult to verify because both governments obscure the data, but estimates have ranged from 30,000 to 60,000 barrels per day at various points over the past decade. Beyond China and Cuba, the buyer network is diffuse and constantly shifting. Syria has received Venezuelan cargoes. Intermediary traders based in Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai have purchased oil on paper, moved it through blending terminals, and sold it onward with the origin scrubbed. Some cargoes have ended up in countries that would be politically embarrassed to acknowledge the transaction, which is precisely why the layered documentation exists. Payment flows through equally indirect channels. Yuan-denominated transactions settled through Chinese correspondent banks. Crypto transfers, particularly stablecoins, used for smaller payments where speed and anonymity matter more than volume. Barter arrangements that bypass currency entirely. Some payments move through front companies in third countries that hold no sanctioned status and can touch the US dollar system without triggering immediate flags. The money, like the oil, travels a route specifically designed to be untraceable by the time it reaches its destination. Washington has not been passive. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, has issued hundreds of designations related to Venezuela since 2017. Individual tankers get blacklisted. Shell companies get named. Executives at PDVSA and its intermediaries get sanctioned personally, their assets frozen, their ability to operate in the dollar system cut off. The Department of Justice has unsealed indictments against shipping brokers, oil traders, and financial intermediaries. The Coast Guard and Navy have intercepted vessels in international waters. By any measure of activity, the U.S. enforcement apparatus has been working hard. The problem is that the architecture it is fighting was specifically designed to absorb that kind of pressure. When OFAC blacklists a tanker, the vessel gets renamed, reflagged, and transferred to a new shell company, sometimes within weeks. The underlying ownership does not change. The routes do not change. The cargo does not change. Only the surface identity changes, and that is enough to reset the compliance clock for most commercial actors who rely on name-based screening tools rather than hull identification numbers or ownership network analysis. Secondary sanctions have been the most aggressive tool in the U.S. arsenal. The logic is powerful in theory. Penalize any foreign company that does business with sanctioned Venezuelan entities, regardless of whether that company has any connection to the United States. This extends American legal reach far beyond American borders. Several Chinese trading companies have been designated under secondary sanctions. Some European shipowners quietly exited the Venezuela trade after receiving informal warnings. Insurance markets in London have largely stopped covering shadow fleet vessels, which is why those ships now rely on obscure mutual insurers and state-backed coverage from countries with no interest in U.S. compliance. But secondary sanctions have a ceiling. Applying them aggressively against large Chinese state enterprises or major financial institutions carries diplomatic and economic costs that the United States has consistently been unwilling to pay. The independent Shandong refineries that absorb most of Venezuela's oil are politically connected enough that sanctioning them at scale would provoke a response from Beijing. So enforcement focuses on the edges: smaller traders, mid-tier brokers, individual vessels, while the core of the network operates with a degree of practical immunity. The result is a system that sheds its outer layers when pressure hits and regrows them when attention moves elsewhere. Every designation creates a brief disruption. None has created a permanent break. Venezuelan shadow fleet is not an emergency workaround. It is not a temporary fix that will dissolve once political conditions change or enforcement tightens. It is infrastructure. It has port relationships, established routes, tested payment channels, and a stable client base. It has survived multiple rounds of sanctions escalation, multiple changes in oil price, and multiple shifts in U.S. foreign policy. At this point, it is more accurate to describe it as a permanent feature of global oil markets than as an anomaly within them. And Venezuela is not alone in using it. Iran has operated a parallel shadow fleet for years, moving somewhere between 1 and 2 million barrels per day through mechanisms nearly identical to the ones described here. These include dark vessel transfers, falsified documentation, shell company ownership, and Chinese independent refiners as end buyers. Russia accelerated construction of its own shadow logistics network after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent price cap imposed by the G7 nations. Within 18 months of those measures taking effect, Russian crude was flowing to India and China through tanker fleets that Western insurers no longer covered and Western tracking firms could only partially monitor. What has emerged across these three separate sanctions regimes targeting three separate countries is something that looks less like evasion and more like the early architecture of a parallel oil trading system. It has its own vessels, its own financing, its own insurance, its own paperwork conventions, and its own enforcement immunity derived not from legal protection, but from geopolitical reality. The countries anchoring demand on the buyer side, primarily China and India, are large enough that the United States cannot sanction them without consequences that dwarf any benefit from cutting off Venezuelan or Iranian revenue. This is the deeper problem that no designation list solves. Sanctions are a tool built for a world where the dollar system was the only system, where Western insurers covered every major vessel, and where access to American financial infrastructure was a prerequisite for participating in global trade. That world is becoming less true every year. The shadow fleet did not create that shift, but it has accelerated it, demonstrated its feasibility, and made it profitable enough that more actors keep joining. Venezuela did not beat American sanctions through brilliance or luck. It beat them because enough of the world decided that the sanctions were someone else's problem. That is a harder thing to sanction than any tanker.